Hello, everyone, and welcome to this exciting LinkedIn Live event. I'm Sandra Colhando, co founder of TransforMe Learning, and I'm thrilled to have you all here. In today's session, we talk about understanding different stages of a diverse women leadership development journey and how organizations can gauge where they are on this path. It's a topic of immense importance, and we have a remarkable guest with us who will be sharing her insights of both her lived experiences and amazing professional background as well. But before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. We would like to pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Let's take a moment to set the stage here. In today's fast paced and ever evolving world, organizations are increasingly recognizing the need to cultivate, empower, and elevate women leaders, not only throughout the organization, but at a senior leadership level as well. Women leadership is not just a matter of diversity, it's a matter of harnessing untapped potential, innovation, and promoting inclusivity. So, whether you're just beginning to explore women leadership programs or you're well on your way promoting diversity and inclusion, this session has something for you. We encourage you to actively engage with us, pop in your questions in the comment section, and share your thoughts in anything and everything that's shared today. We'll be picking up some questions at the end of the session in about 20-25 minutes or so. So, your active participation will really make this discussion even more richer. Our special guest today, Kat Henaway, is an accomplished Indigenous entrepreneur and a seasoned professional with over 25 years of experience. She has designed and delivered some of the most innovative leadership development programs for First Nations and people of color. Kat's unique perspective and extensive background makes her the perfect guide for this discussion. I actually met Kat nearly a year ago, and when it was regarding a business proposal we were talking about, and I was so impressed with her background. And I said, I'm going to get her one day on stage here to talk about her experiences. So that's a little thing I didn't share with you a couple of days ago, Kat, but yeah, you're on my to do list to get you here. So, welcome, Kat. Thank you for being with us today. And
Thank you, Sandra.
I'd love to hear your story. What's your personal story that led you here in supporting uh, Indigenous women, women of color, and doing the amazing work that you do?
Thank you, Sandra. It's a real privilege to be here today. And I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm dialing in from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney. And I too would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Um, I was actually born in Indigenous communities. I was born and raised by my grandparents, who were Torres Strait Islander people in North Queensland, a place called Cairns. And so I grew up with Torres Strait Islander families and very large communities up there. And my mum married an Aboriginal South Sea Islander man. So I was also part of the very big Aboriginal and South Sea Islander communities in North Queensland. So I had a really great privilege of learning about and understanding the three black races in this country. When I was 18, I moved to Sydney and worked in large corporations here, and then I went and lived in the UK for about 8 years. Travelled all around the world, and then came back to Australia in about 2008. And I took myself to university as a mature student, and I studied a Bachelor of Community Management at Macquarie University. And that degree really helped me to understand the history of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander experience here in Australia. And a lot of the policies and government decisions that led to, the state of Indigenous affairs here in Australia. And Then, after that degree, I started specialising in Indigenous engagement. So that's where I started to work with corporations here in Australia, government, universities, and I helped them to design Indigenous programs and ways for these organisations to bring in more First Nations people into their organisations or into their events and programs. And so that's how I started to get into contextualization, creating very bespoke, unique programs for a particular marginalized group. And of course, being First Nations, my passion was to create those programs for First Nations people. And so that's how I started my work in designing programs for people of colour in this country. I started contextualising programs for Indigenous executives at a business school. And from there, I continued to do that type of work, and then, expanded that to contextualise programs for people of colour in Australia and women of colour as well.
Beautiful, Kat. And I can resonate with the passion that's coming from you. Not only studied about Indigenous culture and policies, etc., but you have lived experiences with your family and friends, etc. So where you're coming from is not just a place of passion, but also realities of what life
Mm.
is, what we need to do about it. I know
Mm.
you've partnered with organizations, with governments as well. What would your advice be for an organization that's unclear about why and where to start this journey?
I guess my advice would be that contextualization works. I've been asked this on many occasions by different organizations and different leaders. Why should we contextualize our programs? Because some people and some organizations are afraid of doing that, and they sometimes see it as almost like ghettoizing programs or sort of creating some sort of division. But the answer to that is that if you want to increase engagement, you have to contextualize. So, for example, we see this at universities. If they want to increase more Indigenous students enrolling to universities, they create Indigenous pathway programs. The same with migrant and refugee students. If they want more of those students to enrol at universities, they create very specific programs for refugee and migrant students. It's no different when graduate from university and you go into the corporate world. That type of contextualization still applies, except that when we go into corporate environments, we don't see that contextualization very often at all. So where it works in schools and university sector, in higher education, it actually also works in the corporate sector as well, in government.
And you're saying there's not much happening in the corporate sector, this kind of contextualize. Okay, it's not.
No, very little. Because I think in corporations, we assume that, well, in many corporations, there is a very blended workforce. Um,
Mm.
in many ways, corporations don't have issues engaging diverse employees, um, a diverse workforce. However, I think when it comes to career leadership development and supporting diverse leaders, promotion and hiring of more diverse leaders, I think that's where contextualizing leadership development becomes really valuable. That's something that corporates can really consider doing more of.
Yeah, yeah. And probably later down in the chat, we'll also talk about business impact because that could be a big question mark of why do we need to also invest so much? What are the results and returns? But before we move into the results section, what we've noticed, organizations globally are at different stages of women leadership development. In our work, we've been able to identify stages of, initial stage as explore, where organization just exploring. It's more from an awareness perspective. Should we do it? The whole world's doing it. And so we kind of keep or create that category as organizations not sure, or
Mm,
just starting off with something new. Then the second
mm,
category we look at is where organizations are already emerging. They've already experimented with different women leadership initiatives. They're seeing some results, probably not streamlined, but they're experimenting with it and kind of building that muscle. And of
mhm.
course, we also partner with organizations that are at the stage of flourishing, where you have women leaders claiming the space. There is a good ratio of women leaders.
Yeah.
Wish there were more of them at a leadership positions, and they're also seeing business results, promoting that diverse leadership. What's been your experience in this space? Have you noticed certain markers that define maturity of an organization's women leadership efforts?
Yes, I have seen the difference in organizations, like a lot of the large consulting firms, the banks, the finance houses, and a lot of the large legal firms, a lot of the legal firms, in fact, have very diverse workforces. And so what you find is that these organizations tend to be very efficient. They tend to be very high performing. What I notice is where there are organizations that struggle with diversifying leadership, you tend to notice that the teams are not as high performing. And I actually see this more, it's becoming more obvious to me in when you look at the difference between the corporations that I just mentioned and organizations like government or institutions, where most of the leadership in government institutions is still um, Anglo-Celtic, white European, and so there's very little diversity in bureaucracy and in high levels of leadership in bureaucracy. And this is where we're seeing, I think, uh, more of a need for diversifying that workforce so that these organizations can enhance their performance. I think they need to take a leaf out of the large legal firms, the large consulting firms. They need to take a leaf out of their book and compare the performance of those organizations in comparison to our government institutions.
And that's interesting that you shared. And I'd like to add tech as well. So tech is another
Yeah,
industry that has a
absolutely.
diverse workforce and does a lot of work around it.
Yeah, extremely diverse. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting that the center of power, where you really need to have a equal distribution or representation, that's the area that's struggling right now,
Yeah.
to get people over there and results. And I hope and I know you're doing a lot of work in that space. You're partnering with governments, run open workshops for
Yeah.
women from diverse backgrounds as well.
Yeah.
But when an organization is starting, what's the biggest challenge you feel that organizations or institutions are starting? What's the biggest challenge that you feel that's going to hit them, and how do they overcome it?
I think the biggest challenge that a lot of corporations have, particularly here in Australia, is they're they're afraid to take the first step, and a lot of that has to do with a lack of knowledge of the sector, a lack of knowledge of the capability and the size of the people of colour leadership or First Nations leadership sector. Um, they make assumptions that the sector is not very big. They make assumptions that if they run a program, they're not going to be able to um, sell places in the program or sell the program. There's a lot of assumptions that the First Nations leadership is very small, and or people of colour leadership. These sectors are too small, and those assumptions need to be uh, demystified, and sort of they're not helpful at all. What I've experienced is that whenever I've developed these programs, whilst most of them have started very small, they grow exponentially very quickly. Um, because a lot of the work I do is very innovative. It's often the first type of program, first type of diverse program. It's the first time someone has done something like this. So the market is usually completely unaware of whether these programs will work or not. But usually, given support and given the right leadership, these programs can become very successful very quickly. Um, so yeah, it's just this. There is definitely a fear of starting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I resonate with that because A, the fear of starting, we don't have probably enough data. Second, what are the results? What
Yeah,
initiatives I need to start with?
yeah.
This problem can seem bigger to an organization than it actually is.
Mm,
I also want to add one bit. So, one is we're looking at from an organization's perspective on what they should be doing, exploring in the space of women leadership. What would you say to anyone else in the organization? So, whether I'm a woman professional or whether I'm a professional from different genders who may not have power in an organization, but how can I still promote this with whatever role and space I have?
Um, I think it's raising awareness is a really good thing to do, because sometimes uh, people in decision making roles are not aware that these programs exist. They're also not aware that there are designers out there that have a lot of experience in designing these types of programs. So just making people aware that there are programs that do exist, they are successful. There are lots of people that engage in contextualized programs. I remember when I first started my relationship with Women in Leadership Australia, I actually approached them by writing a message to them on their online form, on their contacts page. And I said to them, "How are you going with your Indigenous engagement?" Because I could see that they didn't have very many Indigenous women in their program. And they called me and said, "Yeah, when we're not doing very well, why do you think that is?" And after an hour's conversation with them, we agreed to partner. And so, just reaching out and letting organisations know that you exist, you'd like to help them, you have this expertise. I mean, that's a really great way to start. I thought it was very fortunate that they replied to me off a contact page,
Yeah.
contact form.
So, and it's very powerful way. It may sound simple, Cat, but just going and asking sometimes
I
can
know.
open this opportunity for providers. And secondly, I was speaking to another wonderful woman leader here in a common community we had, and I was talking about what happens with you in the organization, and she said the same thing what you started off with. She said, as an organization, there is no formal women leadership program that's run,
Mm,
but because I'm part of different communities, I said, hey, I saw that program. And I go to my leader and I'm my boss and say, hey, nominate me for this program. Because very often employees have budgets, organizations have budgets for employees to
mm,
volunteer or raise their hand for a particular learning program. And
mm.
so I claimed and I said, that's fantastic because if participants and leaders are raising their hand and say, hey, I want that, imagine the amount of connection, acknowledgement, results that you look at it because they are seeking it out. It's
Mm.
not a program that's put on them, they're seeking and asking for it. And so it just kind of changes the power equation. So it doesn't sit just with leadership in an organization. It can sit with you, and you could be any role in an organization. It's just
Yeah,
us seeking you maybe shall find it as well.
yeah.
Love that. Love that. And I know, Kat, you specialize in, and one of the few I know in this industry, particularly for First Nations and women of color, often they're both clubbed when we look at, so you have the broad women leadership, and then under women leadership, you have women of color, you have First Nations, sometimes it's all kind of clubbed together in initiative. And in the beginning of the conversation, you talked about how it needs to be customized and have
Mm,
different content for different people. So I have two questions around it. And I had these questions as well when I started off. How does the approach to women leadership differ for Indigenous and then
Mm.
women of colored background and women of non-indigenous communities. What are the unique, if you could probably share two, three unique points for
Mm.
each of these intersections under
Mm.
women? What would that be for an organization or anyone working in this area to focus on?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. This term "women of color" has come up in the last few years, and um, what I've found is that when I've used the term, Indigenous women will say to me, "I'm not a woman of color. I'm First Nations woman," and I've heard African women say to me, "I'm not a woman of color. I'm a Black woman." A lot of you'll find that subsectors of the women of color network won't identify with that. They'll identify with their own culture.
Mm-hmm.
So I found that really interesting. And I absolutely agree from a First Nations women's perspective. We don't see ourselves as women of colour, we see ourselves as First Nations women. And because we've had contextualised programs in Australia, we're very aware of how those programs should be designed and can be designed to enhance our experience in corporations. And our needs and our experience here in Australia are entirely different to migrant and refugee women who settle here. So we will more than likely not identify with a women of colour program as such. We will look for programs that are specifically designed for First Nations people.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that has to do with the fact that our experience is very, very different. So whilst women of colour will relate to certain things, First Nations women will have a different experience of relating. So I have been running programs for women of colour, funded by organisations that specifically want me to open up the programs to First Nations and women of colour. And what I'm finding more and more is that contextualization is really, we have to contextualize to the next level. So whilst we try and aggregate First Nations and women of colour together, it's better to run these types of things separately. And that's what I'm doing now more and more, is looking at, a more levelized approach to contextualization. So I've been approached recently to run First Nations women programs, and I think that makes a lot of sense, certainly to me, to do that for First Nations women and have that separate to any type of women of colour sort of aggregated program. And other subsectors have reached out to me, like Pacific Islander women and Indian women or South Asian women. What I'm hearing more and more is that women from different cultures are wanting their own experience. They're wanting their own contextualization. So whilst we all started in a big group, what I'm seeing now is that there's more of a need for even more contextualization. So that's interesting. That's very much a recent thing.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
so, and that completely makes sense because then you feel it is designed for me and it's relevant.
yeah,
I
totally.
I want to switch the hat to probably an organization who probably is an emerging state. They haven't started anything. They're overwhelmed. There's too much happening. If I'm listening to, I need to contextualize, various programs for the different sect. Let me take a step back. How do we make it easier for them to at least take the first step? Where can they start if they're rolling out, say, a larger women leadership initiative? What can
Yeah.
they do under it that can, tick the box of, starting
Mm.
something, not a really big
Yeah.
a step, but also covering these aspects of
Mm.
context for different cultures?
I think the quickest and easiest way an organization can achieve, uh, rolling out a program or starting something like that is to outsource it to a business that has the expertise. rather than trying to develop these programs yourselves, sometimes it's easier to find a business in your region that is very good at this work and outsource it to them. Uh,
Mm, mm,
that's probably the quickest way to achieve success, because they will have their own network and they will have plenty of experience doing this work, and you
yeah,
don't have to take on that responsibility as an organization to try and work this out yourself.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I like that. It's brilliant. Get the specialist in, support you in
Yeah.
those areas, and make it easier and get into a partnership mode.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Beautiful, beautiful. And I left this question at the end because very often, and I'm sure you'd heard this question many times as well, when you're partnering with organizations or institutions in developing this, one question is, what's the results? And it could be asked directly or indirectly, is what's the impact and outcome of running a successful women leadership program? So if I've run one, what are my success metrics?
Yeah.
And that I feel is the icing for many organizations. When we started off, we didn't actually look into what those success metrics were. We just ran the leadership development. But over the
Mm.
years, kind of worked on let's study this and see whether there's even a business impact for the women leadership programs we run. And
Mm.
last year, when we done this experiment with the client, the results actually exceeded expectation. There was a shift in NPS scores, inclusion scores from 78 to 88%. There was
Mm.
a shift in gender diversity at leadership level. So women leaders were claiming and taking up more leadership positions.
Yeah.
We've had participants talk about and share actual business anecdotes on how programs like this have enhanced the career. They've overcome mind traps. They've had the ability and the power to tackle gender biases
Yeah.
and be future mentors for other women professionals in organizations.
Mm.
And it's so heartening to listen to these success stories because it has a cascading effect that's building a positive momentum. So,
Yeah.
in your view, what are some of the key metrics you've experienced or you shared where an organization can expect or look forward to a successful women leadership program?
I think some of the key metrics are around um, increasing diversity in leadership. What you'll find is that once you place a diverse person in a senior leadership role in an organization, you'll find that um, the entire team will become more diverse. And we saw that in politics um, in some of the leadership development programs I've run in the political space. As soon as we see one or two diverse leaders move into very senior roles, it has a very quick impact on uh, all of the political parties.
Mm, mm,
We advocated for in the progressive political um, parties to culturally diversify the parties more and include more women of colour,
mm,
and the progressive parties were listening. What we didn't know until the last federal election was that the conservative parties were also listening. They just didn't engage with us. So we had more of an impact than we realised, um, just by working with the cohorts that were open to it. But what that did was that influenced the change across the entire sector. Um, so so you know, in I think one of the most important metrics you can measure is having the senior leadership, the diverse women in senior leadership, and measuring the diversification of the entire team or the entire organization.
that's brilliant, Kat. In fact, last week I had one of my colleagues share this data with me. She had shared 1 is to power of three. So she mentioned if you get one woman leader in an executive position, you get three.
Yep.
Pretty quite, and it was this research done. I said that's pretty interesting because I've got a team that's predominantly women in the organization, and maybe that's my bias or anything, but I feel that it kind of helps expand that voice in the organization and that representation. So it was
Yeah.
interesting to know that there's a 1 is to 3 pack. So any
And
organization Sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead.
The funny thing is, I work with a lot of very powerful women, and sometimes when we're putting programs together, they will tap all of their amazing, First Nations women leaders and put amazing teams together. And I have to remind them, whilst I'm all for women's empowerment, um, we need more
Balance.
men. We need
Yes,
more men in our group.
yes, yes, I'm hearing that too. So yes, so we're working on that. But it was interesting to know there is this 1:3 ratio. So it's
Yeah,
good
that
news. So
is.
any organization that's looking at expanding or balancing that, and it could be
Mm,
gender or any other diversities, getting one on and helping that
yeah,
spread. Beautiful. I know we just on the clock, but I want to pick up two questions from the audience, if that's all right with you,
sure.
Kat. So I want to pick up, I think, Sudeepta Sahu. The first question is, yeah, there it's on the screen. What are some of the top challenges faced by women of color? From your experience, maybe top three challenges that you commonly see.
Right. So some of the challenges are around career development. So a lot of career leadership programs in Australia, particularly, are accessible to um, I get to Anglo Celtic and white European people in this country. Um,
Mm,
so they're very easily accessible to them. However, it's a lot harder for First Nations people and for people of colour to access career leadership development. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we see for women of colour
mm,
and First Nations women.
mm,
Um, the other challenges are institutional bias, institutional racism. We
mm,
hear there are loads of reports on that. We hear a lot of anecdotal evidence of that as well. Um, and some of the other challenges, I think we also have our own cultural and religious challenges to face. So as women from, you know, um, different cultural backgrounds, we have certain limitations placed on us culturally and sometimes in terms of our religious beliefs. So we have to manage those challenges within ourselves.
yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, I was
those are
going to
the,
mention. Yeah.
those are the things that are holding us back. Yeah,
Yeah, I was going to mention the third bit was also us holding ourselves back because
yeah,
some way they could be a bias that we are outsiders too, and so claiming the space and
yeah,
fight.
absolutely.
Beautiful. The second question is from Avinash. How do you see the role of mentorship in women's leadership development, and what has been your experience with it?
Yes, I think mentorship is incredibly important. It is vastly underfunded in this country, um, but incredibly powerful. We know that because there are many, many, many reports telling us this. There's a lot of research on the effectiveness of mentorship. Um, the many times that I've been mentored and the times that I am mentoring others, I know they have been very valuable experiences both ways. Um, and also, I think one should never underestimate the experience of being mentored by someone much younger than yourself. I've
Mm,
had two experiences of that in my life where I've been mentored by men who are 20 years younger than me.
mm,
And they have been some of the most powerful experiences of mentoring I've had. So, this idea that we should be mentored by someone that's above us or has
ahead.
older than us or the same gender or the same cultural background, I think we need to demystify that ourselves and really sort of think very differently about, choosing mentors that we would normally not choose ourselves
Yeah, reverse
because we
mentoring.
have very
Absolutely.
powerful experiences in mentoring.
Beautiful, beautiful. I do want to take one last question from Gatik, if that's all right. For the L&D folks here, any tips on how to influence internal leaders on investing in the space for women leadership?
Right. Influencing investing, that is a really interesting one. It's very difficult to do it within your organization. I think you need to find examples outside or examples where it has been successful in other organizations. Maybe get some data on that, some feedback, and present that to your own organization. We all know that organizations like business cases and they like evidence to prove a program will be successful before they invest in it. And you can go and find that information online quite easily. There's quite a number of consulting firms researching this data.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of reports online about the gaps in career leadership development for women of colour and First Nations women. So there's plenty of data out there, but there's also a lot of data on the success of investing in that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So put a good, strong business case together, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. And I would add putting in, a results metric as well. Let's start with the pre and post. Start with a pilot and see the results, because once they start seeing results, then it just you don't need to influence anymore. Then you can go ahead with that project completely. Thank you, Kat. It's been such a rich conversation with you, and thanks for the tips on how to start small in an organization. You don't need to kind of jump and take the whole bandwagon. You start with something small, start with contextualizing it, start with getting experts who can support you in this journey, because the results are very clearly there. There's enough and more data to support that. Having a diverse leadership brings in high performance, brings in credibility, and brings in brand as well. So thank you so much for spending the time here, and thank you
You're
for
welcome.
everyone who's listening and who will be listening to the audience. I hope you've had rich discussions and insights the way I have. Feel free to drop in comments and drop in whatever questions you have. We'll be happy to respond to that. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kat,
Thank
once
you,
again.
Sandra. Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.